Good morning. I'm glad yours went off because I forgot to mute mine. Okay, well, we are going to start a new section, and this one's short. And I got the whole PowerPoint done at one time instead of in pieces. So, I posted it yesterday. I couldn't get to my work email, send you an additional besides the Blackboard email, so I'm sorry. But I don't think this one will take as long as it said on the schedule, so maybe I can actually make up a day or two here. Hopefully. We'll see how far we can get. All right, the early republic. Let's just kind of get an overview. Because by the end of this time period, the country is going to be 50 years old. So this is we're roughly going to go up to 1830. During the first 50 years of our country, not only have we won our independence, become a country, changed our style of government once, land sales west of the Appalachians will be soaring. The population west of the Appalachians between 1800 and 1820 is going to go from 300,000 to 2 million. By 1840, 40% of all Americans are going to live west of the Appalachians, and there will be 8 new states by 1840. Alabama and Mississippi are going to be fed from a stream of immigrants coming out of Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas, Kentucky and Tennessee, out of Maryland and Virginia. The area opened up in the Northwest Territory in upstate New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan are going to be fed from immigrants from the New England states. During this period, you're going to see more opportunities for free African Americans, the fastest growing segment of the population. Remember, a lot of them had been freed during the Revolution. There's natural growth as they form families. There is some manumission by owners. Also, states are outlawing slavery. Mostly the northern states, but there are states that are outlawing slavery. So you have a group And now we can call them African Americans. There's been enough generations that they're not just the first generation Africans that have come in. In 1790, 90% of all Americans lived on the land, a rural home, creating basically what they needed to live. Household production. They raised enough, animals and gardens, supplies to feed themselves. They made their own clothes. And that is starting to fade in this time period. It's changing fast. Some of these are expanding, creating surplus that they can sell. There's new markets. And this is especially true in the South. They're starting to spread. The North has always been more manufacturers and work outside the home, but it's starting even in the South where it's not simply subsistence survival. You can get ahead. Most importantly, America is no longer a colonial entity. We no longer have a higher power over us, at least in the form of another government. And these new ideas, new markets, free enterprise could flourish. So that's what we're going to get through in this time period. By the end, we're there. But let's back up a little bit. If you remember, we had just elected Thomas Jefferson at the end of the last segment. They had passed the Judiciary Act, and the Federalists had slid out of power. On March 4th, 1801, Jefferson was inaugurated as president in Washington, D.C. He's the first president to be inaugurated in the capital city. It wasn't quite built yet. There was the Capitol and the mansion, the White House, but both were still under construction. Poor Jefferson walked to the ceremony from his boarding house, gave his speech, and walked back home. The whole ceremony was primitive and informal. And in his speech, Jefferson stressed unity, the way Washington did, also simplicity and conciliation. The last couple of elections had been relatively ugly, and his speech was one of goodwill, equal and exact justice to all men, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and freedom of persons under the protection of habeas corpus, and trials by juries impartially selected. The wisdom of our sages and the blood of our heroes have been devoted to their attainment. And his inauguration kind of set the tone for his administration. Jefferson, while he had expensive taste personally, avoided pomp and circumstance. He was the first president to pursue the role of party leader and put men in his party in policy-making positions, such as James Madison as Secretary of State and Albert Gallatin, who was a Pennsylvanian Republican. He became the Secretary of Treasury. He was a wise choice, and he was such a good economist, a good money man, numbers man, that Federalists still respected him. But he did put a few Federalists, men of the Federalist controlled New England in some power positions, Attorney General, Secretary of War, and Postmaster. And even though he had promised not to, he succumbed to party pressures to remove Federalist and lesser offices, sometimes by removing the office altogether rather than, replace them with a Republican. And that was part of his plan overall anyway. And we're going to talk about that more in a minute. He runs a very frugal government. In 1802, one of the first Republican acts was to repeal the Judiciary Act that had put so many more positions into the judiciary. And that's going to lead to one of the most landmark court cases, the first landmark court case in American history. And the case is Marbury versus Madison. So what happened was, remember, they had all those positions appointed under the Judiciary Act by the Federalists. And Adams had very quickly filled all of those positions with Federalists. But the notifications had not gone out to everyone. Mayberry, and I did not write his first name down, was a midnight appointee. And Madison, as Secretary of State, had the letter that gave Mayberry his commission, but he's holding on to it with Jefferson's approval. Mayberry knew he was an appointee, and he sues to get his position. And the case goes before the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court doesn't rule for Mayberry, but he rules against the government. He rules that the Judiciary Act was unconstitutional to begin with. That, he doesn't. He rules, and this, to me, this is very confusing. Law can really confuse me. And okay, so y'all remember that the Chief Justice is John Marshall. And John Marshall is the Federalist. And he is going to stay Chief Justice from 1801 to 1835. He's going to go through 5 different presidents. So he rules that the Judiciary Act of 1789 gave the court jurisdiction of mandamus proceedings was unconstitutional because the Constitution specified the court should have original jurisdiction only in cases involving foreign ambassadors or states. But he sets the precedent by saying it is emphatically the provenance and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. So even though Mayberry doesn't get his commission and the Judiciary Act is ruled unconstitutional, the important thing that comes out of this is Marshall sets the precedent that the Supreme Court has the final say. The Supreme Court is the one that says what is constitutional and not, which was exactly what Jefferson feared when they passed the Judiciary Act in 1789. Now, they are going to be able to oust a couple of judges. Because all the judges at this point are very partisan. They're all Federalist. One was declared basically insane. The other one was just overtly partisan. But Marshall is going to hang around, and he is going to establish the foundations of American jurisprudence and the authority of the Supreme Court. And in doing so, he's going to establish the constitutional supremacy of the national government over the states. And this is going to come in a series of steps, but this is the first step, saying that the judicial department gets to say what the laws are and whether the laws are constitutional. So Jefferson started with domestic issues, or we're going to start with his domestic issues. It's kind of a mix. Surprisingly, as much as Jefferson disliked Hamilton and Hamilton's economic plan, he did not set out to immediately dismantle it. And part of that was due to the Secretary of Treasury, Galantine. He patiently explained to Jefferson, you really need a national bank. The bank is good. The bank is necessary. You can't get rid of that. They do disagree about federal debt. Galantine does go along with Hamilton's idea that a little bit of debt is good, builds credit. People will support you more. So he sets out to reduce it and sets up a very frugal government, cutting costs where he can. Some of those were at the expense of poor Federalist appointees, but they would have ended up getting replaced anyway. Cutting out the pomp and circumstance, just cutting back. He also repealed the whiskey tax, which further endeared him to the farmers. The effect of that was that now the only income the government had was selling the western lands and tariffs. Luckily for Jefferson, both of those were going really good at the time. Western land sales had been cut, the price had been cut back through a couple of land acts, and land was selling. People were eager to move west. Ohio was going to get enough people by 1803 to become the 17th state. As far as the tariffs, shipping had increased due to the Napoleonic Wars. This is the American history class, and if you are a history major, you'll have to take world history. But we talk about America like it's in this little bubble and it doesn't, but other world events do affect us. You can't escape them. Even in 1803, when communication takes 2 to 3 weeks and there's an ocean between you and Europe, the Napoleonic Wars affected this young country because the French and the British were busy fighting and they needed supplies. And the New England merchants were more than happy to oblige that. So the first couple of years of the Napoleonic Wars, we're going great guns. Shipping is up, things are looking good. Another cut that Jefferson made was the Army and the Navy. He's going to regret that, but that is a very 18th, 19th century idea that a standing army in peacetime is the arm of a tyrant. That is the case in Europe, but most European states were not republics. We're going to kind of come around after a while. He also managed to pass a law outlining foreign slave trade as of January 1st, 1808. Now, we mentioned this back in the Constitution, that the slave trade would be outlawed in 1808. This is a law that does it, and this is the earliest possible date under the Constitution. And at this point, South Carolina is the only state that still is allowing the import of slaves. Even Georgia has given up on the idea. Now, that doesn't mean the slave trade ends. There's still smugglers. There's like an estimated 300,000 more slaves that are Africans that are going to be smuggled in. And there's now an internal slave trade, which is almost worse. But we'll get into that more later. I have this under domestic issues. It's really actually kind of a diplomatic issue. The Barbary pirates keep coming back. You know, Washington, they start a naval building to fight the pirates, but Washington pays the bribe. They go away for a while, but they keep building the ships. We talked about that. Well, they're acting up again. So maybe we do need that navy. So the Barbary coast of North Africa is made up of Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. We first start again paying blackmail payments to Morocco in 1786. Others kick in the 1790s. But in 1801, the Pasha of Tripoli upped the demands, like way up, 300,000, like 5 times what they'd been asking before. And when they aren't paid promptly, they declare war. So Jefferson blockades Tripoli. And this is going to drag on just with no progress other than, like, you have those little instances of hope. In 1804, you got those really brave people. Lieutenant Stephen Decatur slipped into the harbor with some men under cover of darkness and sets fire to the Philadelphia. Now, the Philadelphia is one of our ships, but it had run aground. And the crew had been taken off and imprisoned. So rather than let Tripoli have the ship, they set it on fire. And after that, the Pasha decides he can settle for 60,000 and the release of the crew. Still a bribe, but it's a much lesser bribe, and we get our crew back. We're going to have one more run-in with the pirates before we're done. This is kind of the heyday for piracy. Even though we still have piracy today, it's not this is more the Jack Sparrow type of piracy, where, even though that was very romanticized. The other and the biggest domestic issue that Jefferson got to deal with was the Louisiana Purchase. This is going to double the size, or more than double the size of the United States. The Louisiana Purchase is going to add approximately 875,000 acres. So, I know people online can't see the map, but you can look at it tomorrow. The yellow is where we're at now. All of this orange is what we're going to buy. Plus, we're going to claim pretty much all of this. And this. Oh no, that comes later. We're going to claim this. Kind of by hook or crook. So, some background. When Adams left office, Louisiana was owned by Spain. Not the greatest neighbors, but it's okay. We can deal with them. They're inciting the Indians from time to time, but it's okay. During the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon takes over Spain. And when they take over Spain, they take back Louisiana. So now Louisiana is owned by the French again, which is a real problem for Jefferson. One, he doesn't want the French neighbors, but he's a Frenchophile. He's always backed the French since the Revolution when they backed us. So now, but Napoleon is a whole different creature. He doesn't want Napoleon as a neighbor, but he really doesn't want to have to back off of his French friendship beliefs. So he sends Robert Livingston to Paris to negotiate rights to the Mississippi. Because we had rights with Spain, we need to make sure we still have the rights with the French. But like I said, Napoleon is a little bit different. The negotiations will drag on. And in 1803, James Monroe heads to Paris to help assist. And then out of nowhere, the French negotiator says, hey, we'll sell the whole thing to you for $15 million. Livingston says, yes, we'll take it. Sounds like a good deal. What happened was the French had lost big in Haiti. They'd lost men in battle. They'd lost men with illness. And Napoleon was having trouble financing his war. He really didn't want to mess with the Americans yet. He's got a continent to conquer first. So let's just sell this to the stupid Americans. We'll come back and win it back later when we decide to take over the whole world. So Livingston says yes. Everybody's excited. And Jefferson's like, but the Constitution doesn't say we can buy land. There's nothing in the Constitution that addresses this. But he was assured by others in government that this fell under his ability, under the executive ability to make treaties, and finally decided that it was worth the risk. The Treaty of Cession was signed on April 30th, 1803. It was ratified 26-6. There was no sectional difference, even though there are some sectional, that didn't come out right the first time, questions. It's ratified 26-6 on December 20th, 1803. Now, Spain still holds West Florida. And West Florida is this purple area. And right after, well, not immediately after, in 1810, it's 7 years later. In 1810, American settlers in Baton Rouge stage a rebellion. They proclaim the area a republic, which we annex. We absorb it into Louisiana, and Louisiana becomes the 18th state. Now, it's not the whole of the Louisiana Purchase, but Louisiana itself. In 1813, we just claim the rest of the Gulf Coast, the parts that's Alabama and Mississippi. And Jefferson kind of vaguely claims that it had been part of the Louisiana Purchase. The area around Baton Rouge are called the Florida parishes, even to this day, because they were originally part of Florida. So we have this whole great new big area, and we want to learn about it, or at least Jefferson does. Jefferson was an amateur scientist, and he's very eager to learn about the Western region. So in 1804, he asked Congress to fund a mapping scientific expedition, not just through Louisiana, but to the far west. We're not entirely sure what is out there. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark are chosen to command, and they set out from St. Louis with their Corps of Discovery, a crew of around 50 members. On their way, they keep detailed journals, they make maps, they learn from the Indians, they fight the Indians, they see lots of critters that have never been seen in the United States up until that point. This area is not completely unexplored. The French had been roaming it as fur traders for years. And they meet lots of fur traders coming down the rivers. They spend their first winter in what is now South Dakota. So they make it all the way over here. That winter went pretty well. In the spring, they send back by river. They send back journals, maps, even a live prairie dog and a live magpie, which have never yet been seen. It's after this first winter that they get Sacagawea to join them. Her husband also joins the group. She is a Shoshone woman who had been captured by another tribe. She had married into the tribe, and she proves to be one of their best guides. They will continue west, and by the next winter, they are in Oregon. So they make it all the way across. They're in Astoria at Fort Clatsop. Was not a fun winter. By this point, their supplies are running low. I mean, they're almost to the eating your shoe point. It really is rough. They will end up eating their horses on the trip back because they start to starve. They come back the next spring. Meriwether comes back the same way. Clark kind of roughly explores Yellowstone, then they meet up and come back. It will take almost a century before all of their exploits are published en masse. But things come out piecemeal, and they really excite people about moving west. There are a lot of opportunities that they see in this, particularly the fur trade. And it really pushes people west. It also gives the United States claim to Oregon, kind of to Washington, but it gives claim by right of exploration and discovery. So later, when we decide that we want that, we can say we've claimed it already. But it really invigorates the country. It's a very exciting thing. The political fallout from this is you're starting to see a shift. The Republicans are getting a little more federalist. The Federalists are becoming a little more Republican, particularly in the area of constitutionality. You know, Jefferson had to decide whether or not it was even constitutional to pay France for the Louisiana Purchase. It's not in the Constitution. Jeffersonians traditionally stood for strict constitutional interpretation, but he decided, maybe it's okay. Now the Federalists are saying, hey, it doesn't say you can do that. Whereas before, if you remember Hamilton, if the ends is justified, then the means is justified. So you're starting to see a switch. The Louisiana Purchase brought the South and the West solidly for Jefferson. The people who had qualms were really losing them. Even the New Englanders were starting to sway towards Jefferson, including men like John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, who had been a very solid Federalist. They're beginning to see that maybe some of Jefferson's policies are okay. You know, the land purchase was great. He's getting us out of debt. Maybe this is not such a bad idea. And the Federalists are panicking. They look to Burr as their next presidential candidate. There's even very slight talk of a secession plot. So most people in American history don't associate secession with the Confederacy. This idea was around way longer than 1860. And it starts with that Kentucky and Virginia resolutions with the idea of nullification and interposition. But the Federalists are starting to think, hey, maybe we just need to take New York and New England and make our own country. We'll secede. It's not seriously considered at this point, but the idea is out there. And that little plot helps lead to the duel. You know, that big duel between Hamilton and Aaron Burr. Hamilton, who is still the leading Federalist, is telling his party, Burr is not the man. We need to avoid him. He's dangerous. And the quote, the thing he said about him was that Burr was, quote, a dangerous man and one who ought not be trusted with the reins of government. Burr took offense. Burr challenged him to a duel. Dueling was very common. That was the way gentlemen settled their differences. Hamilton decided, yes, he would go through with it, he would be brave, but he was not going to shoot his opponent. He went out there with no plans to kill Burr. Unfortunately, Burr did not have any scruples and shot Hamilton through the heart right off. Not only did he kill Hamilton, but he killed any chances he had of a future political career in the United States. But he doesn't completely go away. We'll meet him again. So the election in 1804, instead of having Burr as a presidential candidate, had Charles Pinckney and Rufus King for the Federalists, Thomas Jefferson and George Clinton were the Republicans. An amendment has been passed between 1800 and 1804. After the whole getting a Republican or a Federalist president and a Republican vice president, Congress said, no, we need to fix that. So they pass it, the 12th Amendment, which allows or requires electors to use separate ballots for president and vice president. So you have your first landslide victory. Jefferson wins 162 to 14. Not unanimously like Washington, but pretty solid. And with the Republican Party, or the Federalist Party, sorry, with the Federalist Party kind of fading, definitely weakening, you'll start to see divisions in the Republican Party. John Randolph and the old Republicans make up one group. The Federalists only make up a quarter of the men in Congress right now, so it's easier for party differences to start coming to the surface because they don't have to band together to fight another group. Randolph, who was known as John Randolph of Roanoke, was more of a Jeffersonian than Jefferson was. And the Jeffersonians are becoming more moderate. Kind of what we talked about earlier. Jefferson is starting to see that, hey, not all the Federalist ideas are bad. You know, that national bank is pretty handy. Some of these things, and yeah, maybe we do need to keep a Navy. Maybe we do need to, he hasn't quite convinced himself he needs an Army, but the Navy's a good idea. So it's just starting, but there's starting to be a break in the Republican Party. And then Burr comes back. Because remember, Burr is actually the vice president. He was elected vice president with Jefferson. Now, he had fled the country after the duel. He had fled to Florida. He's also in debt. He's wanted in New York and New Jersey, but he's not wanted in any other state. So he comes back to Washington to resume his duties as vice president. Now, he knows he has no political future. So he conspires with a man named James Watkinson, who is a general in the army. And no one is quite sure exactly the details. The details never came out of what he planned to do, but it's generally believed that he was going to try to convince the people in the Louisiana Purchase to secede from the government and get Britain to back him. He had actually met with the British. Jefferson orders his arrest in 1807 on treason, on charges of treason. He tries to flee. He's caught. He's brought to trial before Marshall, and you're going to, and we get a couple of more precedents. First, Jefferson sets a precedent. He ignores a subpoena from the court, stating that that would compromise the presidency. So he sets the precedent that the president is not subject to court writs. And then Marshall sets a precedent which doesn't, on the surface, does not seem wise, but it is. He defines treason as levying war against the United States or adhering to their enemies. So basically conspiring with the enemy, which Burr actually did by meeting with the British. But Marshall also says you have to have two witnesses to each act. Well, Jefferson couldn't present two witnesses. So Burr gets off. But the precedent, by doing this, Marshall protects the country from the capricious use of treason. Treason had been one of those general charges that the governments, mostly kings, could say, you're treasonous because I don't like you, and have you beheaded. This makes it a little bit harder. You actually have to have proof. Burr will skip bail and he'll flee to France. He'll stay there until 1812 when he actually comes back and practices law in New York until he dies in 78. And like 2 years before he dies, his wife divorces him on grounds of adultery. He's just a character and not in a good way. So we get another ruling by Marshall. So Jefferson kind of loses out on this Burr thing, but he does set that important precedent that the president can protect his position. Let's talk about foreign affairs. Let's see, what slide are we on? How far are we? You know what? Let's stop here because I think I can get through yeah, we'll just stop here. I can get through the next part on Wednesday, and then we'll have the test over this whole section on Wednesday. Sound good? All right. You too. Are y'all